Okay, so hi everyone. Um, we every proposaling group proposed an even division of points, and every responder group accepted that offer. So I just want I want us to discuss for a second. It's going to make more sense, obviously, after lecture, but if you've done the readings, you've probably thought about this. Um, what is the optimal strategy in the ultimatum game? So if you want to raise your hand and turn on your mic, if you want to type into chat, anything's fine. I'll make it easier. What would the optimal strategy be for proposers?
I think can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, I think it kind of depends on what we're proposing and how valuable it is to us. Like, I think with points, it's a little different than with candy. But nonetheless, if the proposers really want to get something out of the deal, I think that for them, they have to try and like make it fair enough in a way that the responders will accept, but they also want to try and give it a little bit of a shift toward them so they kind of get more out of it.
That's a good idea and strategy, and that's what people did in this version. However, if we're talking about sort of mathematical optimality, let's talk about it from the responder's perspective first, actually. So if you're a responder, what is the optimal strategy? If you're the responder, so it's clear. Yeah, so interesting. So the optimal strategy for responders, if you're talking about like mathematical models, something is always more than nothing. So the optimal strategy should be to accept any offer. And this is interesting because this is not necessarily, what people do or even what people should do in real life. But if we're talking sort of mathematical models, um, something is always greater than nothing. So responders should accept any non-zero offer. Now, proposers should then base their strategy on how they expect the responders to behave. And if the responders are being rational, they'll accept anything because anything is greater than nothing. And thinking this, um, a rational, optimal proposer should maximize their own gain, which means they should propose a highly unequal but non-zero payoff to responder and keep the rest. Right, so in this case it would have been, yeah, 5-1 would have been the optimal proposer strategy, and the optimal responder strategy would have been to accept that unequal offer. When I've done this, these slides are on Blackboard. Um, I did not see your email. But I can zip over to Blackboard right now, take a glance at content, and re-upload it because maybe it got screwed up during the, okay, I'm going to edit and I'm going to upload a new version. Um, and then the beauty is that by doing that, hopefully we won't cheese the collaborate session because it'll be uploading in the background. Okay, so I'm uploading a new version of slides. I'm so sorry. I do not know what happened. But they should be up in a couple minutes. So the question is like, the second question is, were we optimal or rational? And it's clear that as proposers, we were not optimal or rational, right? We proposed an egalitarian split. I'll say as responders, we were, or it's hard to tell, right? The responders didn't get tested. And what we're going to talk about starting this week and then much more next week are the ways in which humans are, that's right. And so the question is, the whole question about whether we're optimal or rational depends also on like whether the responders are rational um, and um, and then it's going to depend on a whole bunch of different things. Like in this game, we're doing it once and you don't know who your responder is, and there's never going to be a chance to like punish the proposer except in the context of this game. In real life, you have lots of interactions with people that you know and you're expecting to have repeated interactions, which is very different. But in real life, we also cooperate with anonymously with people we're never going to see again. And some of us, not all of us, cooperate. But I will leave this here, and I want to right. So it might be poor strategy to assume that you're dealing with rational people, right? And in fact, the irrationality might be a good long-term strategy to let others know that you're willing to punish them at a cost to yourself, right? So we're gonna get into that altruistic punishment more next week. We're gonna sort of end this lecture with a little bit about thinking about altruistic punishment. Um, I didn't quite finish the lecture last week in terms of migration as a group selected trait. But I think I'm going to continue. And if we finish up a little early, then I'll come back to migration as a group selected trait. Okay. So in general, the subject of conflict, when we see conflict in animals, things like fights or cannibalism, um, that's an inherently sort of interesting question because when we see parties contesting, then we actually know that there's a conflict. A lot of times, organisms sort of are simply behaving and they don't appear to be in conflict, and that means that the differences or conflicts in interests got sort of resolved in one way or another in the past, and that makes them a little bit harder to see. So we're going to talk about a few examples of sort of coercion and conflict in nature, and then we're going to talk a little bit about prisoner's dilemma, and then how groups can actually favor selfish as well as helpful behavior. Okay, so one of the classic explorations of conflicts in interest are conflicts between parents and offspring. So the first thing is, are there conflicts between parents and offspring? We as, not we in this sense, you as young people um, with, parents that have resources of value often do feel that there's a conflict. And in fact, Trivers was definitely living in, a social political moment in the, 60s, late 60s and 70s, where sort of counterculture and intergenerational conflict was sort of highlighted. Um, and so it kind of makes sense that, he was interested in this question at that time. But he developed this classic mathematical model that kind of explained that even though parents and offspring share genes, um, and we would expect them to share interests, there is in fact conflict between the interests of parents and their own offspring. And so he explored this in what he called weaning conflict in animals, although he was clearly thinking about and talking about people a little bit um, in the paper. So the paper is fantastic. I might throw it up in the Blackboard just as an optional reading, but I did sort of an Excel version of his model to make these graphs, which are actually the graphs are pretty will make hopefully make some sense. So um, he first developed a relationship, and he was just sort of arguing sort of a reasonable relationship that the benefits of parental investment start off increasing really fast and then taper off, which kind of makes sense, right? You can imagine that if a parent, feeds its offspring nothing, they're going to die and their fitness is zero. And then um, there's there's a rapid increase in expected fitness, in this case, expected offspring fecundity with increasing investment. But at some point, if the parents keep bringing food to the nest, the chicks can't eat anymore, they can't grow any faster. They're already, once they're not food limited, there's a limit. And so that shows this tapering relationship, right? And then he picked a mathematical function that would, create a curve like this, but there's nothing like magic about the math. He just I want to curve this shape because that is how I think the benefits of investment work. And it's reasonable, but understand it's not like based on any real data. Um, Now, offspring also benefit from parents' future fecundity. In other words, the offspring share genes with their siblings, right? And so if the parents can make not only can feed you a lot, but can make lots of siblings, your genetic fitness is increasing some. So offspring want the parents to invest not just in themselves, but also in more related siblings to increase their fitness. Um, Now, the harder the parents work, um, the fewer futures, the more they invest in you as a focal offspring, the less they can invest in other siblings. So Trivers represented this as a linear declining function. The greater parental investment in any single offspring, the less their future fecundity will be. And again, there's not a law that says it has to be a line. If you combine those two curves, and so what this curve here is, I'm going to try to, this curve here is the sum of the two fitness curves, right? So here it's 0 plus 0.6. It's starting right on the parental future fecundity line. But when you have the total fitness here is 0.6 from your fecundity plus like 0.4 from the parent's future fecundity, and that's going to be around 0.1, just a little over zero point 0.1. Right? So this red line is the sum of the two curves. And what's interesting is There's an optimum. Come on. There's an optimum. Um, a parental investment that an optimum parental investment that, whoops, that maximizes. I don't have to retype it. Offspring fitness, right? And that's over here. So if the parent invests 1.5, that maximizes fitness. Because it's weird, because your own fecundity continues to rise, but it rises so slow that the loss of offspring that mom and dad are going to be able to make, the loss of siblings, is cost you more than being able to eat more. So here's the thing, though. Um, Parents and offspring share twice as many genes as grandparents share with their grandchildren, which kind of makes sense. And what that means is that your offspring mean more to you than they mean to your parents genetically. In other words, parents want to produce probably more siblings, and they don't care as much as you do about how many children you have, because those are going to be half again as related. So that's what this lower curve here is symbolizing. That's how much does your future fecundity count for your parents, not for you. Um, let's go over that. So um, you share half of your genes with your offspring, right? Because you contribute half of your genes, but then half of your offspring's genes come from someone else who is hopefully unrelated. Um, in a similar vein, you share half your genes with a full sibling. Why? Well, um, you share you share a quarter of your genes through your parents, because I share half my genes through my mom, and then she has a 50-50% chance of any gene that I got from mom also giving it to a sibling. But then, so that's 1/2 times 1/2 equals a quarter. But that's through mom. But then through dad, there's also 1/2 times 1/2 equals a quarter. And so the sum is 1/2. When you're calculating relatedness through a pedigree, the shorthand rule is your relatedness to anyone else on a pedigree chart is equal to the sum of 1/2 raised to the power of each of the number of steps between you and that other individual, and the sum for each pathway of 1/2 raised to the power of the number of steps on that pathway. So here there's 2 steps, that's 1/2 squared, but there's another pathway that's also 2 steps, and that's also 1/2 squared. So you share half of your genes with a full sib. However, your parents share only a quarter of their genes with any of their grandchildren, right? So mom shares 1/2. Whoops, it keeps not doing the pen. Okay, she shares 1/2 times 1/2, 1/2 squared. So mom shares a quarter of her genes with her offspring. But dad has also just one path, sharing 1/2 times and 1/2. So dad also just shares a quarter of his genes with any of his grandchildren. So that means grandchildren are worth, your children are worth more to you genetically than they are to your parents. And what that means is that the parental investment that maximizes parental fitness is going to be a little bit different because they're going to be adding this shallower curve, which is the benefit that they get from investing more in you, to this to the same future fecundity curve that they had before. And look, when you add up these two curves, you get a lower optimum. Really, it's optimal for the parents. The optimal investment from the parents' perspective is lower than the optimal investment from the offspring's perspective. And what that means is there's an area of conflict, right? Um, and the conflict is over here. Offspring want this, but parents want this. A lower level of investment. Cool. So how does this conflict, do we see this conflict? And in fact, we do. And it points out why that it's a really interesting question. Why do chicks beg at the nest? I mean, it's a really weird thing. Like, if the parents and the chicks had the exact same interests, the chicks wouldn't need to beg, or they'd need to do a little, a single little cheep saying beep, like I'm still hungry, and the parents would just feed them the food, right? Because the chicks and the parents should both want them to have the same amount of investment. But in fact, chicks are begging like crazy, which raises an interesting question, like why are they doing that? And it turns out it's this really it the most likely explanation is that begging behavior is kind of a like a holding yourself hostage showdown with your parents. We're going to go into there's other reasons why chicks beg, but um, the first thing to understand is that begging is costly. It's energetically costly, and that's been measured, but it's also costly in terms of predation risk. So this is a review paper by Brisky. Each one of these points is a different study. And what it's showing is that um, the higher the daily predation rate, the more dangerous it is for chicks in the nest, the quieter they beg, right? So this is a really interesting pattern. And it just goes to show you that like begging is a dangerous behavior for chicks because it attracts predators to the nest. So we talked about residuals before. This is amplitude is loudness. Residual amplitude means bigger chicks can make more noise. You do a regression of um, loudness of begging on body size. And then what's left over is the residual. And it turns out that daily predation rate explains a lot of the residual, a lot of what's left about how loud chicks are begging. And so in more dangerous areas, they're quieter. I mean, the interesting pattern that this was explaining is that in the tropics, where there's much higher daily predation rates, a lot of bird species, the chicks don't beg at all, which is kind of interesting. Um, so there's a number of studies indicating how dangerous it is for chicks to beg. So in this study by Ibanez Alamo et al., they put a brood parasite that calls a lot. So cuckoos are brood parasites, and they beg loudly. And what they found was nests with brood parasites added had much higher daily predation rates, whereas just one additional blackbird or removing a blackbird, they had lower predation rates. So it's basically showing that the noise that the cuckoo chicks are making is very costly because it's attracting predators. This is one last study by Half and McGrath, where a speaker playing back begging calls increase the probabilities of predators visiting nests. And this is done sometimes with uh, just with actual nests, and sometimes it's done with artificial nests. But there's been many, many papers showing that it's costly for chicks to beg. The reason why they're begging is because basically they're threatening the parents, saying, feed me or I will attract a predator to this nest and I will die and you will have zero fitness, right? It's a really interesting kind of, showdown. There's other reasons for chicks to beg. Um, Chicks sometimes have to beg just to show that they're healthy enough to be worth further investment, right? That they're healthy enough to basically to make it profitable to keep feeding them. And this is shown in species where there's a visual signal as well as an auditory one, and one of the visual signals is this red coloring. And so if you increase the red coloring, parents feed them more. Why do they do that? Red coloring is a reflection of immune function, the strength of their immune system. And this has been seen by if you induce an immune response by injecting foreign proteins, sheep red blood cell. That's what SRBC is in the next graph, sheep red blood cells. You will increase the amount of red. Um, when you do that, you decrease the amount of red and increase the amount of yellow when they have been food deprived, right? So that's what this figure is showing. If the chicks are um, the sort of whammy of stress, if they have enlarged broods and um, they've been food deprived, then they have a yellow response when you inject them with the SRBC. Um, However, um, if you if you just do straight inject them with SRBC, um, they the enlarged broods are a little bit yellower. The reduced broods are no change. Um, and if you don't inject them with SRBC, then they're not different from each other. They tend to have a redder response. Okay, so summary is that parents and offspring have a lot in common. They share genes, and so offspring don't want the parents to invest everything in themselves as individuals. However, the optimum, the where fitness is maximized for the offspring, is higher in terms of parental investment than the optimum from the parents. So the offspring and the parents have shared but not identical interests. And begging is an example of a trait that is thought to be honest because it's costly. Um, And the fact that the chicks have to beg and do this behavior that puts themselves in danger shows that parents and offspring are not exactly on the same page. Basically, the parents have to threaten the offspring with their own death from nest predators, from snakes or things that they can't fly away from. Um, and it also raises the question about, how honest the begging signal is. But it seems to be an honest signal in a number of ways, because it's clearly costly for the offspring, and it reflects their sort of immunocompetence and their body condition. Like, it's harder for them to make a red signal if they're stressed, and if they're in a brood that's been enlarged, so um, they're in weaker condition. There's the conflict between parents and offspring is seen a lot in terms of brood size, right? So offspring should, by Trivers' model, want to be part of smaller broods where the parents invest more in each individual, whereas parents should want larger broods that have a larger total number of offspring or grandchildren, even if that comes at the cost of the number of children produced by each child, right? So in general, parental optimal brood sizes should be larger than offspring optimal brood sizes. And we see conflicts over brood sizes. Sometimes the parents are in control, sometimes the offspring are in control. Sometimes everything seems to be somewhat cooperative. So in the Pachycondyla villosa, an ant species, the unmated workers lay trophic eggs to feed the queen's offspring. So brood size seems to be sort of agreed upon between the queen and the workers, which, remember, are her offspring. So the workers seem to have shared interests with the queen in offspring production in this case. And similarly, in a number of tree frogs, the ones that will lay their eggs in bromeliads, in the little tiny pools that form in the base of plants with these broad leaves that collect water. The parents will lay eggs, and after the young hatch, they will lay smaller eggs called trophic eggs for the young to feed. So let me just define what that means. Trophic eggs are produced to feed offspring. But that means that, like, the brood size is being reduced, but there isn't a conflict between the parents and the offspring. The parents are producing these eggs in a form that's easy for the young to eat. It's a way of parental care and feeding. So there's clearly no conflict. However, oftentimes brood size is reduced in a way that shows conflict among siblings or between siblings and their parents. So this is a parasitic wasp right over here. That's the wasp. She's laying her eggs in these caterpillars. And fascinatingly, sometimes the eggs can divide a number of times after they've been laid, turning each one into a wasp larva themselves, and that's called polyambry. So parasitic wasps, the basic idea is that they lay their eggs in hosts, usually the larval stage of hosts. After the eggs are laid, the female leaves. That actually means that the offspring are in control of brood size, and so they can be adjusted to the offspring optimum instead of the parents. So this is a case where the offspring are in control, and what they do is they tend to reduce offspring, and they also change the sex ratio. And that's significant because Hymenoptera have this interesting genetic sex determination called haplodiploidy. Males are haploid, females are diploid. And that actually means that Brothers share half of their genes on average. So if mom is, undergoing meiosis to make a haploid egg, half of her genes are in any of the eggs. And so the version of genes that one male gets with another, shares with another, is 50-50. Um, on average, brothers share half of their genes. However, if males are haploid, that means, so if males have only one set of chromosomes, whereas females have two sets, right? One that came from mom and one that came from dad. That means I should change the colors a little bit. Let's change this guy. Wait a second. Okay, I don't know if that's going to be helpful. Um, when the male now can make only one kind of gamete, one kind of sperm that has just this single set of chromosomes, right? So that means, but females can then contribute either either chromosome, and unfortunately, a that's I chose colors that are too similar. Um, but that means that a female shares 50% of her genes, or a quarter of her genes through mom, but then 100% of 50%, 50% of their genes through dad. That means that each sister is 3/4 related to each other, each full sister. So sisters are more related to each other than they are to brothers. That should affect the that should affect the sort of optimal sex ratio of the brood, and sisters should want female biased broods um, if they're controlling the sex ratio, whereas mom is equally related to all her offspring and she should want a 50-50 sex ratio. So what happens? Um, what happens is what happens is that males also share fewer of their genes with each other, and so they should be in sort of more conflict in terms of wanting to have all their offspring for themselves. So what happens is a parasitoid may lay a single egg, it's male or female, and then that egg replicates a few times. Um, and so creating a brood of males or a brood of females. And what happens is the broods of males have more conflict and get reduced. They end up smaller than the broods composed of females. So it's not a huge effect, but the male broods end up being usually only a single survivor in these different species of parasitic wasps, whereas the females usually have two larvae surviving. And the crazy thing is it starts off with a huge number of young in a polyembryonic brood, and then they, through sort of cannibalism and conflict, they get reduced, but the female broods have less conflict and end up being larger. Okay, and of course, that's what I was saying. Full sisters share more genes with each other than with than with brothers. The more times that queens mate, um, the more the more the less related sisters are to each other. This is a typo. They share 50%. Um, However, the more times that queens mate, the less related sisters are to each other, and the less there's a difference between the proportion of genes shared between brothers and sisters. Um, So this effect is strongest if the queen mates only once. And that leads to a prediction that if you allow a female ant, in this case, Formica truncorum, to mate just once, the then females are much more related to her sisters than they are to brothers. The sex ratio shifts more towards females, but if the female's been mated multiply, the sex ratio doesn't significantly switch, right? So that's what we're seeing here. P of greater than 0.1, multiply mated, no shift in sex ratio. But when the queen was mated just once, strong shift towards females. So here we see a conflict between offspring and parents and a conflict among siblings. And basically, since the siblings, in the case of ants, the workers control who they feed. And in the case of wasps, where mom lays eggs and then disappears, in both those cases, the offspring are in control of this conflict. They win. Okay, so take-home messages: conflict is found in relationships between and among relatives as well as non-relatives, right? So Dawkins has been stressing, how relatedness leads to cooperation. It's important to understand that there is genetic conflict among relatives, not just among non-relatives. Relatedness has a big impact on parent-offspring and sibling-sibling conflict, right? Because offspring are more related to themselves and their own children. Parents want to maximize the total number of offspring, the total number of grandchildren, not the maximum fitness of any individual offspring. That's going to lead to conflicts. Parents want larger broods. They want even sex ratios. Offspring want smaller broods. And in the case of the bees, ants, and the wasps, where they're more related to sisters than brothers, they'll either be less conflict among sisters. That was the parasitic wasps, or they'll shift the sex ratio towards sisters. That's the ant example. And then the last sort of take home from like studying conflict in animals is that it's really interesting, and let the behavior guide their thinking. So if they're fighting, that's the nice indication that there's something that they're worth fighting over. Okay. Um, that sort of ends the conflict part, and now we're going to talk about evolutionarily stable strategies and reciprocity itself. So I think now is actually a good time to take a break, and we'll start off. I'll be ready to go. We can say we'll start off at 8. I'll be ready to go a little bit before 8. Let's pause here.